What would you do if a simple glance from a stranger, one you misinterpreted, sent you spiraling into an uncontrollable rage? For one unsuspecting waiter, that fleeting moment would ignite a deadly chain of events, as a misunderstanding turned into a nightmare that would change everything. It's a Friday evening, and the air in a bustling restaurant is thick with the hum of chatter, clinking glasses, and the sizzle of food. The lighting is soft, casting a warm glow over the wooden tables and shiny silverware, creating an inviting ambience. It seems like a normal night for everyone, until HOA Karen walks in. A woman in her late 30s, with sharp features and a demeanor that instantly demands attention. HOA Karen has a reputation. A reputation built on entitlement and a hair-trigger temper. Tonight, she's come to the restaurant to unwind after a long week, but her idea of relaxation is easily disrupted by the smallest inconvenience. As she settles into her seat, her eyes scan the room with a critical gaze. The waiter, a young man named Jack, approaches her table with a friendly smile, unaware that his next actions would set off an unexpected storm. He's just trying to do his job, to make sure her evening goes smoothly, but something in his expression, a slight smirk, maybe, catches HOA Karen off guard. It's subtle, but in her mind, it's enough. Enough to make her feel disrespected, belittled. A moment's confusion morphs into a perception of insult. The tension in her chest tightens. The waiter has ruined her night, and for that, there's a price to pay. What happens next? Well, that's where everything begins to unravel. It all started with a glance. A fleeting moment, easily missed by anyone else, but not by HOA Karen. As the young waiter, Jack, approached her table, ready to take her order, his eyes briefly met hers. It was nothing more than a simple exchange of glances. But in HOA Karen's mind, something stirred, something that made her feel like she had just been insulted in the most personal of ways. Jack didn't even notice it. He didn't know he had done anything wrong. But for HOA Karen, that small, unintentional glance was all the confirmation she needed. She was sure of it now, he had smirked at her. He had disrespected her. Maybe it was just a flicker of a smile, but to HOA Karen, it wasn't innocent. It was deliberate. It was mocking. It was as if he was judging her, belittling her, making her the butt of some unspoken joke. As Jack stood there, nervously clutching his notepad, waiting for her order, HOA Karen's mind began to race. She could feel the blood rising to her face, her chest tightening as the anger brewed inside her. She had always prided herself on her sense of control, her ability to hold herself with dignity in public spaces, but this felt like a challenge. "Is there something funny?" she asked, her voice tight, laced with an icy edge. Jack blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" "The way you looked at me," she continued, her words slow, deliberate. "Like I was some kind of joke. Like you thought I was beneath you." Jack stammered, completely confused. "Ma'am, I didn't mean anything by it. I'm just here to take your order." But HOA Karen wasn't listening. She couldn't. The perception of being disrespected, even in the slightest, had already begun to take hold. She could feel the anger crawling up her spine like a slow-moving tide, and there was no way to stop it now. She wasn't used to being ignored or belittled. In fact, she had never been anything but the center of attention. People around her, wherever she went, treated her with reverence, as if her presence alone commanded respect. This was different. This waiter, a nobody in her eyes, was challenging her. And for that, he needed to be put in his place. "I don't appreciate being mocked," she snapped. "And I certainly don't appreciate being treated like I'm invisible." Jack, visibly flustered, began to apologize again, but HOA Karen wasn't having it. The more he spoke, the more she spiraled. Her thoughts were clouded with the idea that he had done this on purpose. She kept replaying that moment in her mind, the look on his face, the slight twitch of his lips. How dare he? "You know," she muttered under her breath, "I've dealt with people like you before. always trying to make others feel small. Jack, now panicked, took a step back, his voice shaky. "I'm really sorry, ma'am, I just want to make sure you're happy with your service. Please, let me know if there's anything I can do." But Karen's mind was no longer listening to reason. Every word out of his mouth only fueled her anger further. The more he apologized, the more it seemed like he was trying to manipulate her into thinking she was the problem. She wasn't the problem. He was. He had disrespected her first, and now it was her turn to show him that no one, was allowed to treat her like this. The restaurant, once warm and inviting, now felt suffocating. The noise of the other patrons seemed distant, muffled, as if they were all watching her, waiting to see what would happen next. Her heart pounded in her chest, her pulse quickening as her breath became shallow. Her palms began to sweat. She had been trying so hard to hold it together, but the weight of it all, of being slighted, of being made to feel small, was too much to bear. In a flash, her thoughts shifted. This wasn't just about a smirk or an insult. This was about something deeper, something more personal. Karen wasn't just angry at Jack, she was angry at the world. At how she had spent years building an image, cultivating power, only to have it shattered by something as trivial as a waiter's glance. A memory flashed in her mind, one she hadn't thought about in years. She was a little girl, sitting at the dinner table with her parents. Her father, always the strict one, would look at her with such pride when she succeeded, but he never once told her he loved her. It was always about perfection, about doing things right. And when she made a mistake, the disappointment in his eyes was enough to make her feel like she didn't exist. That feeling, that sense of being insignificant, had never left her. She had spent her entire adult life trying to make sure no one could ever make her feel that way again. She became successful, influential, powerful. She was the one who commanded respect, not the other way around. But Jack, this young waiter, with his casual attitude and unbothered smile, had made her feel vulnerable, exposed, just like she had as a child. And it made her angry. Furious, even. Her hands trembled as she clenched them into fists. She was so close now, so close to making him understand what it meant to cross her. The line between self-control and chaos was razor thin, and she could feel herself slipping. "You think this is funny?" she hissed, her voice dangerously low. "You think you can just disrespect me and get away with it?" Jack's eyes widened, and he stepped back again, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The misunderstanding had festered into something much darker than he could have ever imagined. He had no idea what he was about to unleash. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted as Karen's rage reached its peak. She could no longer hear Jack's apologies. All she could hear was the rush of blood in her ears, the pounding of her heart. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, but it wasn't just nerves anymore, it was adrenaline. The world around her began to blur, and all that mattered now was making Jack understand that no one, was ever going to disrespect her again. In that moment, she felt a strange calmness wash over her. It was as though everything had led to this. It wasn't about the waiter anymore. It was about her. About reclaiming the power she had worked so hard to build. And she would do whatever it took to make sure he understood that. The restaurant was silent now, but inside Karen's mind, the noise was deafening. The flicker of the waiter's smile, or was it a smirk, had ignited something deep within her. She had convinced herself, with every passing second, that this wasn't just a mistake or an innocent moment. No, it was a deliberate act of disrespect. And the longer she stood there, the more convinced she became that he had crossed a line that couldn't be erased or undone. Jack had taken another step back, but he hadn't moved far enough away. She could still hear his voice, pleading for her forgiveness, trying to soothe her, but the words blended into the background, muffled by the thunderous roar of her heartbeat. The anger boiled in her chest, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel the heat of the rage building inside her, threatening to consume everything in its path. She wanted to shout, to scream at him, to make him understand how deeply he had hurt her, but something darker than words was rising to the surface. It was as if the world around her had slowed to a crawl. The movement in the restaurant, the noise of the other patrons laughing and chatting, it all felt distant. Her breath was shallow, quick. She didn't even notice that her hand had moved to her purse. The metallic clink of the zipper echoed in her ears as she opened it, her fingers trembling. She could feel the cold, smooth surface of the gun nestled inside, and for a moment, it seemed to shine in the dim light of the restaurant, almost beckoning her. She didn't think, she acted. With a swift motion, her hand wrapped around the cold grip of the gun. The shock of its weight in her palm was a jolt of reality. She had never thought it would come to this. She had never imagined she'd be standing here, holding a weapon, ready to take someone's life. But the anger, the humiliation, the years of feeling overlooked and disrespected, it all led here, to this moment. She raised the gun, and everything else faded away. Jack's face froze as he saw the gun. His eyes widened in confusion and fear, but Karen couldn't stop now. The gun was steady in her hands, and all she could focus on was the anger that had been building inside her. Her finger brushed the trigger, and time seemed to stretch in that moment, the space between her and Jack growing impossibly wide. She could hear the faint whisper of her own breath, and the steady thump of her pulse in her ears. Her eyes locked with Jack's. He was still frozen, still unable to fully grasp what was happening. And then, it happened. The moment that would change everything. In one split second, everything snapped into focus. The sharp sound of the gunshot shattered the silence, a deafening crack that echoed throughout the restaurant. The sound reverberated in her chest, in her skull, and for a brief moment, the world around her was nothing but a blur of sound and motion. Her eyes were wide, her heart racing, but all she could focus on was the way Jack's body jerked backward as the bullet hit him. He fell, his face contorted in pain, as he crumpled to the ground, his legs giving way beneath him. Time seemed to stop. Everything in the room stood still as she watched him fall. Her fingers were still gripping the gun, her arm trembling with the weight of her own actions. For a brief, fleeting moment, she felt a rush of adrenaline, an overwhelming sense of power. The satisfaction of finally putting someone in their place. But that feeling didn't last long. As Jack hit the floor, a hollow silence descended on the restaurant. No one moved. No one spoke. The air was thick with disbelief, and Karen's heart began to sink as the realization of what she had just done washed over her like a cold wave. Her breath hitched in her chest as she stared at Jack's still form. The waiter, the man she had convinced herself had disrespected her, was now lying motionless on the floor, blood pooling around him. The weapon in her hand felt heavier, colder, and the reality of the situation crashed down on her. What had she done? What had she just thrown away for the sake of an insult, for a moment's confusion? She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, her breath ragged as she slowly lowered the gun. The noise of the restaurant came rushing back all at once, murmurs of shock, gasps of horror, the clattering of chairs as people stood in stunned disbelief. Karen's gaze darted around the room, but her mind couldn't focus on anything. She could hear Jack's labored breathing, the soft groan that escaped him as he fought to hold on to life. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she dropped to the ground beside him, her hands trembling as she reached out, almost involuntarily, as if trying to undo the damage she had done. But it was too late. There was no undoing this. The gun was still in her hand, the weight of her decision unbearable. The initial rush of power faded, replaced with the crushing realization that she had taken a life, and for what? A misunderstanding? The silence in the restaurant was suffocating now, and the distant wail of sirens could be heard in the background. Karen could feel the walls closing in on her as the seconds stretched into eternity. She had lost control. She had become everything she had worked so hard not to be, a person who let emotions dictate her actions, who let pride and anger destroy everything. Her vision blurred as she looked down at the waiter, at Jack, whose life now lay in her hands, irreparably changed. The shock was starting to settle in, but it was too little, too late. The damage had been done, and now there was no going back. The moment the gunshot rang out, chaos exploded in the restaurant. The deafening crack of the bullet seemed to echo in every corner, drowning out the ambient noises that had filled the room just moments before. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The patrons sat frozen in their seats, eyes wide with shock, their faces pale as they processed the sudden violence that had unfolded before them. Jack, the young waiter, lay motionless on the ground, his body twisted in an unnatural way. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, but it was clear he was severely injured. Blood pooled around him, staining the once pristine floor of the restaurant. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare, but for Hoa Karen, it was no longer a nightmare, this was her reality now. She stood there, paralyzed, the gun still gripped tightly in her hand, her mind racing. The cold weight of the weapon seemed to burn through her fingers, reminding her of the irreversible decision she had just made. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. All she could hear was the pounding of her heart in her ears, and the slow, ragged breathing of Jack, who was still alive, but barely clinging to it. In an instant, the quiet was shattered by the sounds of hurried footsteps. People were scrambling, some standing, some ducking under tables, others frantically pulling out their phones to call the police. One woman screamed, the high-pitched sound piercing the air, while others whispered in disbelief, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The waiter had been shot. A life had been taken. The restaurant was no longer a place of calm and comfort, it had become a crime scene. But Hoa Karen couldn't hear the panic around her. She couldn't process the voices shouting, the sirens wailing in the distance. All she could do was stare down at the lifeless body of the waiter, the man she had just killed over a simple misunderstanding. She felt her legs give out beneath her, and she collapsed to her knees. The gun slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor beside her, its metallic sound somehow louder than anything else. She stared at it, numb, as if it were an object she didn't recognize, an object that had no place in her life. But she knew, deep down, that it was hers now. It was a part of her, a symbol of everything she had just destroyed. Her breathing became shallow, panicked. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat, and the guilt began to suffocate her. What had she done? She thought, her mind screaming for answers she couldn't find. Had it all been worth it? Was the moment of perceived disrespect, just a smirk, a look, really worth taking someone's life? Her chest tightened with each passing second as the weight of her actions sank in. It hadn't been a smirk. She realized it then, with a sudden clarity that hit her like a physical blow. It was nothing more than a misunderstanding. A look, an accidental smile, a simple gesture. Jack had never intended to mock her. He hadn't even noticed her anger. And yet, she had taken his life. She looked around, her eyes meeting the gazes of the stunned onlookers. A few were still frozen, some with their phones pointed at her, others with their hands over their mouths in shock. But none of their faces showed the disdain she had expected. Instead, there was only fear, confusion, and pity. What had I become? She wondered, her eyes filling with tears. How could I let something so small, so insignificant, push me to this point? The anger that had burned so fiercely inside her just moments ago was now replaced by something darker, remorse. Deep, searing regret. She had lost control. She had allowed her emotions, her fragile sense of dignity, to dictate her actions in the worst possible way. A figure appeared in her peripheral vision, a police officer, arriving at the scene, his gun drawn, his face hard and focused. He approached cautiously, and when he saw her kneeling on the floor, he immediately ordered her to get on her knees, her hands in the air. The sirens were getting louder, and Hoa Karen realized that this was the end of it. There was no turning back. There was no explanation that could justify what she had just done. She felt herself trembling, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from Jack's body. She couldn't move her gaze from the place where his life had been so violently taken from him. Was he going to survive? Was there hope for him? The question echoed in her mind, but she already knew the answer. The damage was done. As the officer cuffed her hands behind her back and led her away, she couldn't shake the image of Jack, the waiter she had once thought of as an insignificant part of her evening, lying lifeless on the ground. He never smirked at me, she thought, her mind clouded with the weight of her mistake. He was just doing his job. But by then, it didn't matter. Her world had shattered, her reputation destroyed, and for what? A moment's rage, a misperceived slight, a single, fatal misstep. The sirens wailed louder, drawing nearer, but to HOA Karen, they felt like the sound of her own heart breaking, irrevocably broken by the choice she had made. The flashing lights of the police car reflected off the restaurant's windows as HOA Karen was led outside, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back. She barely noticed the cold air as it hit her skin, or the murmurs of the crowd, or the flashes from cameras. All she could feel was the numbness creeping over her, an emptiness so deep it seemed to consume every part of her being. Her eyes were locked on the ground as the officer guided her to the patrol car, his grip firm around her arm. The gravity of what had happened, the irreversible damage she had done, was beginning to settle in. The gunshot, the blood, the way Jack had collapsed in front of her, it was all replaying in her mind like a haunting loop she couldn't escape. But now, more than ever, she could feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. As she was shoved into the back of the squad car, her mind drifted to the moment she pulled the trigger. The anger, the feeling of being wronged, the burning desire to reclaim her dignity, it had felt so justified in that moment. But now, sitting in the cold, sterile confines of the car, she realized it was all based on a lie. A simple misunderstanding. The realization hit her like a freight train. She had killed a man, over something so trivial. Her perception had twisted the situation, warped it beyond recognition. Jack had never smirked at her, never mocked her. She had created that narrative in her own mind. The tiny flicker of a smile from him, a simple gesture she had blown out of proportion, had spiraled into a nightmare she couldn't wake from. In that moment, the truth became clear, and the weight of guilt overwhelmed her. She had acted on impulse, letting her fragile ego dictate her actions. She had convinced herself that she was being disrespected, and in her anger, she took it too far. The car doors slammed shut, the noise making her jump. The officer climbed into the front seat and started the engine, but before they drove away, HOA Karen overheard voices from outside the car, faint but clear. He never smirked at her. He was just trying to make her feel better, one of the paramedics said. She must have taken it the wrong way. Those words sliced through her like a razor. He never smirked at me. She wanted to scream, to tell them that she had been right, that it was him, that he had been the one who had made her feel small. But deep down, she knew it was a lie she had told herself, one she had believed for far too long. The officer glanced over his shoulder at her, his expression unreadable. She didn't meet his gaze. She couldn't. The crushing weight of what she had done, the irreversible act she had committed, was now all too clear. She had taken a life. And for what? A look? A moment of imagined disrespect? The realization struck her with full force, and her breath hitched in her throat as the tears began to fall. The weight of everything, the destruction of a life, her own dignity shattered, crashed down on her all at once. She sobbed silently, her shoulders shaking with each uncontrollable breath. The journey to the police station felt like an eternity. Time stretched out, and every second was a reminder of her mistake. She thought about Jack, his family, his friends, his life cut short by her reckless actions. She had taken everything from him, and for what? Her pride? Her perception? As the car rolled into the police station, the finality of the situation seemed to engulf her. She would face the consequences now, but the punishment, whether it was years in prison or something worse, would never undo the destruction she had wrought. Nothing could bring Jack back. Nothing could fix the damage she had done to her own soul. As the officer opened the door, he paused, glancing at her. For a moment, their eyes met, and she saw something in his gaze, perhaps pity, perhaps something more, before he helped her out of the car. But the truth was, there was no saving her now. The doors to the station swung open, and HOA Karen was ushered inside, her heart heavy with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. And as she walked through the corridors, she couldn't stop thinking about how fragile perception truly was. How a single misjudgment, a moment of misplaced pride, could unravel an entire life. Had Jack really deserved to die? Had he ever even disrespected her, or was it all just in her head? The truth, as it turned out, was far more complex than she had ever realized. But in the end, it didn't matter. The consequences were real. The life lost was real. The world would never see her the same way again. And neither would she. As the door closed behind her, the finality of her fate became clear. But the lingering question remained: how many more lives, her own included, had been irrevocably changed by a single moment of misperception? The answer was clear, but it could never undo the destruction that had been done. As we close the chapter on this tragic story, we're left with one undeniable truth: our perceptions shape the reality we live in, but they can also destroy us. HOA Karen's actions were driven by a moment's misjudgment, and in the blink of an eye, she altered not only her own life but someone else's as well. It's a reminder of how fragile our sense of self can be, and how dangerous it can be when we let pride and anger cloud our judgment. What do you think? Was HOA Karen justified in her actions, or was this just a case of letting emotions go too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. If you found this story powerful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales like this. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Next time, we'll dive into another shocking story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Stay tuned.